your Friday Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. Glad to have you back for the final show of the week. Good one coming up. Chris Hine joins me here in just a little bit to talk Timberwolves basketball, D'Angelo Russell trade, trade deadline, the implications of that league-wide, but particularly with the Timberwolves, Mike Conley coming in, what that means now, for right now, what it means down the road, why the Wolves made that move. We heard from Tim Connolly on Thursday night as well. Chris will offer some perspective on what the Wolves president of basketball operations said about the trade, what he liked about it. Just some interesting kind of fallout from it, and maybe a little bit of a tumultuous end to the D'Angelo Russell era. Chris and I'll get into that a little bit. I'll add a little context to that as well towards the end. Got Justin Jefferson winning an award, but almost overshadowed and winning Offensive Player of the Year by his quarterback, Kirk Cousins, singing at the NFL Awards show Thursday. Get to that at the very end of the show in case you missed that. First, though, what did I really miss? Let's start with the Wild. It's kind of funny. On Thursday afternoon, I was in the office for a while, had a moment of quiet, and I was kind of coming up with segment ideas for Friday's show, and I knew I wanted to drill down a little bit on the Wild and some of the struggles they've been having offensively and specifically in 5-on-5 situations this year compared to last year. So I'm gathering up all this data from Hockey Reference, Natural Stat Trick, things like that, and I'm like, oh man, but they play tonight. I can't record a segment right now. I got to wait and see, what happens against Vegas. Does that change the narrative? Does that give me then a cause for a pivot point? Say, hey, this was a struggle until now, but it got, it changed against Vegas. Is there, or is something going to happen that kind of dilutes the narrative that I was coming up with? And folks, I'm here to tell you that the Wild actually played directly into the narrative, losing 5-1 to Vegas on Thursday night, a really dismal showing for the Wild. And as luck would have it, as I was putting together a lot of this information, their one goal was a power play goal, so 0 goals in 5-on-5 situations, while Vegas got, I believe, 3 in 5-on-5 situations and did not get a power play tally. Got a penalty shot, but did not get a 5-on-4 power play goal against the Wild. So some thoughts on the Wild and just kind of where they are right now and kind of how we've gotten to this point in the season where they're struggling to score goals. Lost 3 in a row coming out of the All-Star break. Started with that bad loss to the Coyotes where they had the 2-1 lead in the third period, but kind of let that one get away. And then, of course, losing to better teams now, Dallas and Vegas in consecutive nights. But really kind of a microcosm of a bigger problem and a structural change this season with the team. And I hesitate to say it's necessarily even a bad thing overall, the way they're constructed this year, the way they're trying to win this year. But I think at the end of the day, we have to frame this as a team that underwent a pretty significant stylistic change from last year to this year, and one that was probably forced by the recognition that they probably overachieved offensively last season. I'll get to some of the numbers on that in a minute. And that, frankly, they just had a talent drop-off from last year to this year, too, which was necessitated by the trade of Kevin Fiala, which was necessitated by Parisi and Suter hitting the books in a way that they hadn't before. Those buyouts are going to be a problem, and that does cause a certain talent drain. Now, here's what I think is happening a little bit with the team right now. I think they're in a little bit of a lull because sometimes they still want to be that team that can come back and win, but they're not that team right now. Last year's team, so many comeback wins, so much fun, and it's more fun to win 5-4, to come to racing back, dramatic win, pull the goalie. It's more fun to win like that than to grind out a 3-2 win or a 3-1 win or a 2-1 win or whatever it is. I know the points count the same, but the process is different. And I think this year's team has by and large bought into the new identity, but sometimes struggles with it because when you get into these lulls, these pockets of a season where you're not scoring, where it's not fun, then you have some problems because you need to score at least a little bit. and then you start to get a little bit too aggressive in certain situations, and things all fall apart. Now, Dean Evison had something to say about that after the loss to Vegas, that 5-1 loss. Here was the first thing he said along those lines after Thursday's game.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to come out of it, and everybody's talking about the goals and this and that, and I'm sure we feel that, we got to do something a little bit extra, and you don't. You have to stay structurally strong.
Now, I still get the sense, like he said, that the defensive lapses bother him more right now than the lack of scoring. And I don't know if they should. I think both of them should bother him equally. I don't know if they just need to stay the course or, kind of play their systems. Yes, they do to a certain degree, but also they got to score. Like, maybe something needs to change scoring-wise because 5-on-5, they're not getting it done. Let's run some numbers that illustrate that before we get to another Dean Evison quote. So this season, the Wild in 5-on-5 situations, updated through Thursday's loss, they have scored 85 goals and allowed 91 goals 5-on-5. Now, you remember, they were tremendous 5-on-5 hockey team last season. That was basically the thing that carried them to that franchise record in points that sent them soaring into the postseason. They scored 207 5-on-5 goals last season and gave up 150. They're averaging almost a full goal less 5-on-5 this season than they were last year. They scored about 2.5 a game, 5-on-5 last season. This year it's about 1.7. They're giving up almost exactly the same, 1.8 in 5-on-5 situations, but they're not scoring at nearly the same rate. Their expected goals this year per natural stat trick, and it's about the same on Hockey Reference, is 98 in 5-on-5 situations. So they're not scoring as much as they should be in terms of where you might expect them to be, but there's also some outliers from last year that are catching up to them in 5-on-5 situations and across the board. Ryan Hartman last season had 33 even strength goals. 33 even strength goals a year ago. He has 5 this season. Kirill Kaprizov had 33 even strength goals last year. This year he has 15. Of course, no Kevin Fiala this season. He had 27 even strength goals for the Wild last season. He is not on the team anymore. Team shooting percentage is down overall this season. They were number 2 in the entire NHL at 11.4%. 11.4% of their shots went in the net last season. That was number 2 in the entire league. Some of that's some volatility. Some of that's quality of chances, but some of that is just volatility from year to year. Maybe think about that somewhat of a luck category. Think about that maybe like turnover differential in the National Football League, where there's going to be some variance from year to year. Some of that is luck. They are 22nd overall this season. They're shooting just 9.5%. That's below league average. And like I said, 22nd overall. So some of this is explained by not getting as many pucks to go in the net because they're just not scoring on as many of their shots. But the saving grace is that they've been much better in 5-on-4 situations. The power play was such a problem last year. The penalty kill was such a problem last year. They're outscoring teams 43-31 in 5-on-4 situations this year, and that includes shorthanded goals and power play goals. Last year, they were outscored 65-47 in 5-on-4 situations, and that really hurt them in the postseason. So if you think about how they're constructed right now, they might actually be in better shape playoff-wise once they get there, if they get there, than they are right now. But this year's team is a lot different than last year's team, and that was another thing that Dean Evison said after the game on Thursday.
We talked earlier in the year about it's a different team, right? There's some reasons we think, obviously, and we can't, not going to get into everything, but yeah, we haven't. It's different. It's a different feel from last year. It's not the same team. It's not the same feel when we get down, and obviously our confidence is whatever. I'm not crazy about we got to find a way to gather that too. But, we got to keep grinding. We got to keep the thought process, the belief that we're going to catch some breaks.
And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but no better illustration of the difference between last year's team and this year's team, at least in terms of an individual group, than the top line. Last year's top line, Ryan Hartman, Kirill Kaprizov, and Matt Zuccarello had 83 even strength goals between the three of them. This year, They have 32 between those three guys. Now, some of that's a little bit. Hartman's been injured for some of the season, but a lot of it is just straight up that those guys have not been clicking in the same way. They've been reunited for the last couple of games. It has not really mattered. That line's still not going right now. That's maybe their last hope. That's maybe their best hope for getting this thing going at a certain point, because that line was very good 5-on-5 last season. It just hasn't been the same this year. But that is one of the biggest differences between this year and last year, in addition to Kevin Fiala not being there to anchor that second line. Now, not all hope is lost, of course. Like I said, much better on the power play, better on the penalty kill, better in the special teams overall, maybe better equipped to win in the playoffs if they can get there. But right now, kind of right on the fringes. Can they get there? I don't know. It's going to be a battle over the last 30 games or so. I guess the biggest picture takeaway from this is that this team's got to find that kind of sweet spot that they've been in at various points of the season between scoring enough to win, being disciplined, but not confusing their identity between last year and this year's team. I know it's not fun all the time. It's not fun to win necessarily the way you win. The points count the same. If they can get back into that mode where they score enough, where they don't feel desperate enough to start chasing pucks and giving away those turnovers, like Dean Evison was saying, that is probably their game this season, even if it's not as much fun, and even if it does stand in stark contrast, and even if it does mean maybe they're not as good of a 5-on-5 team as last year, it does stand in contrast, but maybe it is the way forward.
Take a playcation to Mystic Lake. With 24/7 gaming, the good times never have to end. And you can satisfy your cravings at our restaurants and bars. Or relax in one of our luxurious hotel rooms. Those that play together, stay together. And don't forget to join Club M so you can spark new memories and bask in the rewards along the way. Follow the lights to Mystic Lake, where every day is playday.
Let's bring in Chris Hine right now. It is late on Thursday as we record right now. Chris desperately wants to go to bed. I've been keeping him. We had to wait for Tim Connolly to talk. We had to wait for various bedtimes to occur for my children.
We had to wait for your kids to go to bed.
Yes, we had to wait. Yes. There were a lot of delays on Thursday. I knew all along that I wanted to talk about the trade deadline. I did not know it would be so eventful, Chris, in many ways. But wow, D'Lo is gone. I talked about that a little bit on Thursday's show already. But Chris, from your perspective, and after hearing from Tim Connolly Thursday night, what do you think of what were the overriding things that were driving this deal for, that D'Lo's out and Mike Conley is in, and with these other pieces and draft picks along the way?
So I think it's three different things that were in play here, and that's kind of what I gleaned from what Connolly said, and kind of what you could just kind of look at this trade on the surface and pull apart on your own too, without having to hear from him. Number one is a different stylistic fit when it comes to how a point guard will be operating within this framework of Towns, Gobert, Edwards moving forward. Definitely somebody who's got a lower usage rate, who's not going to take as many shots, not as you don't have to get him necessarily going on a given night the way you would with D'Lo for him to be really effective. More of a pass first setup man, and Connolly emphasized that in some ways he thinks as Conley has gotten older.
Yes.
That's going to trip me up for
adding
however long Mike Conley is with the Timberwolves.
Different spellings, but the names are very
when you
similar.
say it, when you say it out loud, it's hard not to confuse the two.
Maybe we need to over enunciate Connolly and
right.
Conley. Maybe we need to do that from now
on. But as Conley has gotten older, he's become more of a game manager, according to Tim Connolly.
Yes.
So that's one facet of the trade is just, and we've seen it too since Karl-Anthony Towns went down. You can't have a night where Anthony Edwards isn't somehow heavily involved in the offense, and that not that I'd have to go back and look, but the early part of the season, everybody was kind of inconsistent with how things were operating offensively.
Yes.
In terms of like number of shots they were getting and things like that. But if there's one thing we've learned over the last 40 games or however many it's been since Carl's been out, it's that Ant needs to be the focal point pretty much of this offense and Carl is likely the 1B or number 2 option, because Ant drives a lot of the defensive attention. So that's number one, a different stylistic fit. Number 2, and not that Connolly spoke ill of D'Angelo Russell in this department, but he raved about Conley's, just habits, culture setting, all those buzzwords that you hear a lot from NBA GMs and people in charge, and how much of an impact that's going to have on a younger roster, specifically with Anthony Edwards. And we've heard this going back from when Gerson Rosas was here, the need to surround Ant with veterans who do things the right way and make an impression on him. We saw it with Ricky Rubio that first year, Pat Bev last year, Austin Rivers to a certain extent this year, and now here comes Mike Conley. So that's another prong in this trade.
Now, being that effusive in his praise of Conley, being that does make you think that they weren't at least getting as much of that from D'Angelo Russell as they would want. And Russell's at a different stage of his career. He's not a young player anymore. He's in his 8th year, just like Towns is. But, he's at a different stage of his career, maybe not at that kind of veteran dispensing wisdom phase, or maybe just maybe that's just not how he's wired necessarily. Or what did you... The contrast,
maybe the latter there, maybe
the contrast there stands out to me, that he would praise Conley in that context suggests that they weren't getting what they maybe the same things out of D'Lo.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be an indictment on the kind of player or person D'Angelo Russell is. It's just a different guy, a different approach,
and maybe it's what
different
maybe
tone setting,
more what they need, because Anthony Edwards maybe needs that.
Different tone setting. Somebody who has also been through several playoff battles. I think him and Gobert would be easily, off the top of my head, the most playoff experienced people on this roster. D'Angelo Russell, for even though he's younger, has not been through that. And we saw that came back to bite them last year against Memphis. I think Conley's experience in big moments, his experience navigating, I think it's his 16th season this year. They value that. You can argue whether that's something that should be valued or not, but it is something that they value. The right kind of culture fit, and that's one of the reasons why they made the trade. The third reason, and I think it's also a significant one, is the financial aspect of this. D'Lo was about to be an expiring contract who could have left in free agency, and it would have complicated their ability to operate in that sweet spot between above the salary cap and below the luxury tax. They wouldn't have just been able to take D'Lo's $30 million to $31 million and just sign people for that much money, because you need to be under the cap to do that, right? And,
correct. And in this case, now they have that slot where he's already on your team, where then you have the kind of maneuverability that you would want.
Right. And you can, trade out of it. You can work around it and do things with it. So now Conley, who's making, I think it's like maybe 8-9-ish million less than Russell this year, and it jumps up to like 22 million or so, jumps up to 24 million next year. We'll see what they do with that, but the timing works out, because if, let's say, Conley just walks after next season, the Wolves do have a lot of money coming on the books for the 2024-25 season. They have Towns' Supermax. They have Edwards' likely max extension coming on the books, and Jaden McDaniels' likely lucrative extension coming on the books. So that's 3 very large contracts that they're going to have to accommodate for the 2024-25 season, when Mike Conley's contract at 36 years old would be expiring. So now, if from that timing standpoint, it kind of makes sense.
It does. I mean, I think I like the move in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of it to me, and we've talked about D'Angelo Russell on this podcast plenty, and I've talked about it by myself plenty. I mean, he's a good player in a lot of regards, but the fit always the fit felt weird, especially when Chris Finch arrived. It just never quite seemed like D'Angelo Russell was the Chris Finch point guard, right? I mean, I think Finch tried to make it work. I think he could make it work in certain ways, but the way that the way that D'Angelo Russell runs offense seems a little bit at odds with the way that Chris Finch might want to run an offense, and especially as Ant got further into his career, needed the ball more, was gonna have a higher usage rate. Having a point guard like D'Angelo, even though those guys worked well together in this last 2 or 3 month stretch where Russell was shooting better, it's never felt like that was quite going to be the sustainable partnership or model going forward. So part of this for me was a little bit of addition by subtraction, even though Russell had been playing much better this year. The other interesting piece to me is that Conley and Gobert obviously have this history, and the last couple seasons in Utah, obviously it's not just them; it's a lot of guys there. Jordan Clarkson, they had Joe Ingles for a while, obviously Donovan Mitchell, a lot of other good pieces there. But they had like the number 1 offensive rating one of those years, number 3 another one of those years. Those guys have a pretty good thing going. How do you imagine the pairing of Conley and Gobert potentially unlocks some of the stuff that they wanted to see from Gobert that they just haven't seen, that maybe Russell and Gobert weren't developing quickly enough?
Yeah, well, I mean, you just look at the time they spent together. It was like 3 seasons worth of experience. So there's some muscle memory built up there, and we'll talk more maybe with Finch tomorrow at shoot around specifically about how that's going to look. But I can't say I've gone back and watched a lot of film currently as to how that's going to work.
Right.
But I'm sure that in moments there's going to be things that those guys can fall back on when other things may not be working, that they'll be able to try, and just maybe little 2-man actions that they used to do once upon a time, and try to get things going. We saw how much of a struggle it was to try and get on the same page, and there was a lot of frustration there with D'Angelo Russell at times. I think back to, and I wrote about this for Friday's paper, I think back to a moment in Charlotte after they lost to the Hornets, and I just asked him a general question about just the fit with Gobert and how things were going, and his answer was very short and to the point.
Yeah.
It was he catch the ball, he'll score. That's what he said. It was kind of the first visible sign of frustration. That was late November that happened. So it was frustrating for Russell, I think, at times. Not that it was unworkable or anything like that, but here you have a chance to bring in a guy who's already worked with them for 3 years, and you put all the other stuff on top of that, and from the Wolves' point of view, that's why they did it.
A few more things for you. I mean, one being, we don't know exactly where this is all headed, but this doesn't feel like this isn't the final move in any kind of roster construction. This is a piece of the puzzle along the way that gives them, like you said, like we talked about, a little bit more flexibility into next year with that salary slot preserved. They got 3 second-round picks in this trade. I don't think that can be discounted because they lost, obviously, a lot of draft capital in the Gobert trade. And even though these are second-round picks, not first-round picks, they've added, the ability to either draft or use those as, ways to get other players potentially in future trade deadlines or other trade scenarios. But, the roster at this point, I think, like you said, the hierarchy seems like it was cleared up a little bit more because, Edwards seems to be clearly emerging as the one. If and when Towns returns, you imagine he has a pretty outsized role still, a high usage, but there's not kind of this D'Angelo Russell kind of third wheel kind of in the mix anymore. Conley's a lot more kind of role players, maybe a wrong word, but maybe at this stage of his career, kind of like that, more of a connector than he is a star player. So you've got that piece kind of figured out, but big picture sense, how do you feel like this all fits together, and kind of what's the next evolution? Because even still, when those Utah teams were really good, they still got knocked pretty quickly out of the playoffs because teams could find a way to beat this style when push came to shove.
Yeah, I it's been such a whirlwind the last 24 hours. I haven't given much big picture thought to anything.
Of course, yes.
you do wonder defensively. I'm just spitballing here
Of course,
as I
yeah.
think about it. You don't have a ton of speed on the floor.
No.
Or quickness, right? You have Ant and you have Jaden. And Carl is quick for a big man, but
Yeah,
not
but
quick
not a 4.
overall. Right.
He's not quick
Right.
for a 4. He's quick for a 5.
Right.
Yeah.
So you don't have a ton of quickness in that sense. So I wonder how that's going to work. Now, maybe that favors playing a drop where it's just, hey, Rudy's at the rim, and if guys go by us, it's not the worst thing in the world. And we'll just secure the perimeters as best we can and let Rudy deal with the inside. But, I don't know how successful that's going to be, because one of the things that Utah struggled with in the playoffs was just containing the ball. And, Rudy felt like he had to be in two places at once at times. And that's how he got, quote unquote, played off the floor.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know how it's going to look defensively. We'll see how it meshes. Obviously Conley, in addition to having 3 years worth of offense with Gobert, has 3 years worth of defense with him.
Yeah.
They have Ant and Jaden on the ball, or maybe, just in crunch time lineups, maybe Conley comes off the floor and you have Ant, Jaden, Kyle Anderson, Carl, and Rudy as your potential lineup, or a closing lineup or something like that.
Unless you're going against 5 smalls kind of lineups, that would not be a good lineup necessarily to defend that. But against certain teams, that could be your best lineup against a lot of teams, depending on what the personnel was. It does give them. I mean, I feel like the depth of this year's team, which has been necessitated in different points, and we saw that, obviously in that Utah game where, Luka Garza scores 25 points, Jalen Noel has 30. They get a double from the rookie that's never playing. I mean, they've got some guys that have some kind of unique skill sets to be able to help them in certain configurations. It is just kind of interesting to imagine how it all does eventually fit together. Bigger picture, that's an easier one to answer because it's more of a retrospect than a look forward. I mean, it's been almost exactly 3 years to the day since Russell arrived, and a lot of factors play into why this thing never quite got untracked the way Gerson Rosas would have imagined it. I mean, a month after he gets here, there's COVID, there's, the season shut down.
Right.
They don't get a lot of time together right away. There's kind of that weird space where, he and Towns don't get really a whole lot of time to work together at all. The chemistry between Towns and Russell on the court never seemed to quite click in the way that they might have wanted it to. Ultimately, how do you characterize the 3 years here? And to you, was this just kind of an inevitability, whether it was after the playoff series last year or just going into the contract year, that this was going to be the outcome and not some sort of long-term partnership via an extension?
Yeah, I think when Russell came here, I think Gerson Rosas had this idea that he was getting this point guard at like 23 years old, who had just been an all-star. Timeline, right? Who was ascending in his career and had these leaps in front of him, right?
Yeah.
And those leaps just never really happened for one reason or another, right? I think that was the expectation, that like he had traded for this person who was, and Gerson was in Houston back in the day when they trade for James Harden, and Harden, his career takes off from that moment in time, right? And everybody thought Harden was a really good player already. It's not like he came out of nowhere, but he went to a whole other level once Houston traded for him and kind of built the machine around him.
Right.
So Gerson comes in, and I think he was trying to maybe recreate a little bit of that with Russell, where it's like you take this guy who's like a borderline all-star already, and you put him in the right situation, and all of a sudden he's making the leap, into all league kind of player, which just never happened. That's not to say Russell's a bad player, but he is basically kind of who he was back then. There was never really too much improvement year to year that you could really notice. Yes, he's having his best shooting year of his career. But he also had the best year of his career in a contract year previously. Is that sustainable going forward? Is this his first significant leap where he's going to become a 40% 3-point shooter for the peak years of his career? I would tend to think not, just based on his track record. But I think that's it. There's just never those leaps that I think they were expecting once upon a time, and the synergy with Carl, never quite matched up on the court, to their own admission. So just a number of factors. Not to say it was a failure of a term. I mean, last year was a good year for them overall, and kind of set this franchise back on the right track. But it was never the pipe dream that everybody had 3 years ago.
No, that's a good point, and maybe kind of leads into the last thought. I mean, this partnership ending does mean, the trade they made, I think it makes the Lakers better. And does the NBA now have a rule that that Malik Beasley and Jared Vanderbilt have to be traded in tandem? Because this is someone pointed out to me on Twitter, this is the third straight time that they've been traded together, is it not?
It is. It's the third straight time they've been traded together. Third straight time that Tim Connolly has been involved.
That's true.
In a trade with them.
Yes, it's amazing.
So I don't know what's going on here. They're just kind of joined at the hip in that sense, I guess.
But the Lakers got better. The Suns obviously got better with the Kevin Durant move. The Mavericks got better recently when they added Kyrie Irving. I mean, if the West, if your Q&A with Conley a week or two ago, where he was talking about the West being wide open, I don't know if the West is quite as wide open.
Well, it's interesting. I asked that to him actually tonight, just his opinion about the Western Conference landscape. And he said, he's like, yeah, you see all these moves and things like that, but let's see how everything shakes out and how guys gel with each other and how teams, actually fit together after making these moves midstream. So, I think he was a little more skeptical as to how everything, and listen, you got to throw the Wolves in that mix too. I mean, they made a pretty significant move here. Nothing says they're going to be clicking right away either. So, we'll see.
I think he clearly sees value though in this season still, even if this is not a championship roster yet, that he was not willing to say, it doesn't really matter so much if we make the play-in, playoffs, or miss this year. I think that still holds value to him. I
think it does too, but I also think you have to have value to you. You could when you made that trade for Gobert, you can't punt on any year. Yeah. Barring a significant rash of serious injuries to everybody involved. Yeah. You just don't, first of all, there's no draft incentive to do it this year because you don't have your pick. So there's, no incentive from that reason. But yeah, you've got a limited window here. Rudy Gobert is not getting any younger. He's in his 30s, and you have to maximize the years that are in front of you here. You have to maximize the time that Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels are still on their rookie deals. Yeah. Because it's going to become a little harder to find a point guard if you're just tracking things out down the road, with how their contracts are going to be coming on the books. Where do you get your point guard in 2 years? Who is your point guard in 2 years? Is it 37-year-old Mike Conley at that point on a new deal? Or where's that point guard coming from? I don't know. So you can't afford to punt on any year. You got to put, that's the pressure they put on themselves by making that trade.
Yeah. Well, and, going, I think now 20-17 since Towns got hurt probably gave them a little bit of if that's what we are with, Gobert's missed some time in there. Obviously Russell hasn't played in a few of those games, including obviously last night right before he got traded. If you can do that with kind of the assembled parts, maybe something could happen down the stretch here, like I said, if and when Towns comes back. And again, we don't know anything about that. That's still very much hanging out there unless that was addressed tonight in some way.
It wasn't. No, we still don't have there's no timetable. Right. And we saw a few weeks ago that Carl was fairly angry when there was a timetable put on his return. Right. And, people started asking him about it. So they've been very careful not to put any sort of timetable on his return.
Well, I'll save all the conspiracy theories and stuff for another day because I do think it's interesting what might happen here going forward. But I do think they've positioned themselves for the rest of this season to be interesting, gave themselves a chance this year. See what Mike Conley can do in that role, and see where the rest of this roster kind of takes shape around that with Conley minus D'Angelo Russell. Do we know yet how soon he'll get in here, or Alexander too?
We don't know. We'll see what happens tomorrow. They're listed as questionable, so just based on definition of that, there's a chance. But I don't know what the hurdles are like in terms of clearing their physicals and all that stuff. And if they do that, do the Wolves just want to throw them out there without any acclimation to what they're doing? I don't know, but we'll find out in the morning.
We always do. Well, Chris Hine, appreciate it. Go get some sleep, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good, Mike.
Good stuff from Chris, as usual. Final point that I will make on this, I'll circle back to something he and I were talking about earlier when he was mentioning how Tim Connolly was praising Mike Conley's veteran presence, how he will be kind of a better fit in terms of kind of molding this roster and being a leader, things like that. I can't help but think that there's a subtle, polite contrast being stated there by Tim Connolly to D'Angelo Russell and between him and Mike Conley Jr. Now, I don't think he's trying to trash D'Angelo Russell on the way out. I don't think that means that D'Angelo Russell is a bad player. What I do think it maybe means is there was some indication maybe that Russell wasn't always the best teammate in the world and that they think Mike Conley Jr. will be a better fit as a teammate standpoint. Whether he is as good of a basketball player as D'Angelo Russell is right now, I think that's debatable. I think D'Lo probably brings more to the table to a certain degree in certain skill sets, but I do think Mike Conley Jr. is a better fit for this team on the court and quite possibly off the court as well. Let's finish with the cooler. I expected Justin Jefferson to win Offensive Player of the Year in the NFL, which he did on Thursday. Kudos to Justin Jefferson. Big award, big season for him. I did not expect at any point Thursday to see his quarterback, Kirk Cousins, on the NFL award show singing with Kelly Clarkson about Tom Brady. That was a moment. Kirk in chains, in a suit, singing a little bit, talking about Tom Brady. It was a viral moment, I guess. It was awkward, just awkward enough. It was awkward in the vein of Kirk Cousins' awkwardness. It was endearing to a certain degree. If you missed it, it's all over social media, so go check that out. Kirk Cousins having a good year in terms of his image, in terms of his marketability, things like that. And you know what? He is still the guy who threw all those passes to Justin Jefferson this year and helped him be the offensive MVP, Offensive Player of the Year of this league. So there you have it, Kirk Cousins. Quite a season for you. And go sing with Kelly Clarkson whenever you want. That'll do it for this week. Plenty of good stuff coming up next week. We'll see you then. Enjoy the weekend. I'm Michael Rand, back at it again on Monday.